I was filing a noise complaint when New Carthage died. Sector 7 had a harvest festival running 3 decibels over the permitted limit. Someone's anti-gravity float had clipped a transit line and blocked the morning commute for about 400 people. Standard Tuesday. The kind of problem that made up 90% of my work as a peacekeeping corps commander. Not battles, not strategy, just the endless low hum of people living too close together and stepping on each other's toes. My name is Sira Voss. I had not fired a weapon outside a training range in 8 years. I was reaching for my coffee when the feed died. Not flickered, not glitched, died. Every screen in the command center went static simultaneously, and then, one by one, they came back pulling from backup satellites, rerouting through emergency relays, and what they showed me was not New Carthage. It was a crater. Still glowing at the edges, 4 million people, 11 minutes, that was all it took. I sat in my chair, and I did not move for a very long time. The Verk had come out of dark space without a single signal, without a declaration, without even the courtesy of an ultimatum. Their fleet had appeared directly above New Carthage like a bad thought you cannot shake, and then they had done what they came to do. A thermal cascade strike. The kind that does not leave ruins. The kind that leaves glass. 11 minutes. I kept coming back to that number. 11. The festival in Sector 7 had been louder than regulation for longer than that. Someone behind me was making calls. Someone else was pulling up the Accord emergency protocols. There was noise in the room, the kind of noise that happens when trained people do not know what to do and fill the silence with motion instead. I understood it. I was doing my own version of it. I pulled up the incident report form. I needed to do something with my hands. The form had 43 fields: location of incident, nature of complaint, estimated number of individuals affected. I got to that one and stopped. I looked at the field for a long time. It wanted a number, a clean, fillable number. I typed 4 million and then deleted it because the form was clearly designed for noise complaints and zoning disputes, and it did not know what to do with 4 million any more than I did. I closed the form. The Verk's message came through 12 minutes after the strike. It was brief. It was translated by 3 different AI systems, and all 3 translations came back identical, which meant there was no ambiguity, no diplomatic wiggle room, no possibility of misunderstanding. Humanity was a mistake the Accord kept alive. We have begun the correction. That was it. No list of demands, no terms, no window for negotiation, just a statement of intent delivered after the fact, the way you might explain to someone why you had rearranged their furniture, not asking, not apologizing, simply informing. The Accord convened an emergency session within the hour. I watched it on the secondary screen, while the primary screen still showed me the glowing rim of what had been the most beautiful colony humanity had built in 200 years. The Keth spoke first, in their slow, layered harmonics that the translators always struggled with. The Solari followed. Then the Ven. Each one condemned the strike. Each one used careful, measured language. Each one referenced the sacred framework of the 3,000-year peace. Strongly worded condemnation. That was the phrase, strongly worded condemnation. I looked at the crater on my screen. I looked at the phrase on my secondary screen. I thought about the Harvest Festival in Sector 7, and the noise complaint I had been filing, and the anti-gravity float, and the 400 people stuck in the commute, and how all of them, every single one, was now a name on a list that nobody had started compiling, yet because we were all still sitting in our chairs not moving. The briefing room emptied slowly. People went to make calls, to find their families, to cry somewhere private, to pray. I stayed. I don't know why exactly. It felt wrong to leave. It felt like leaving would mean accepting that the screen was showing me something real, and as long as I stayed in the chair, I could maintain the small, stupid fiction that I was still waiting for the image to resolve properly. The crater did not resolve. It just cooled very slightly at the edges. I pulled up the Pax Accord on my console. I had never read it in full. Nobody I knew had read it in full. It was 3,000 years old, and it was the founding document of galactic peace, and it was, in its way, the reason I existed. The reason the Peacekeeping Corps existed. The reason my job was noise complaints and zoning disputes instead of something that required the skills my great-grandfather had apparently had, and that I had apparently inherited in some dormant, untested form. I read every page. It was, in many places, genuinely beautiful. It spoke about the right of every species to exist without fear. It spoke about the shared project of civilization. It spoke about the long arc of sapient life bending, inevitably, toward peace. It had been written by people who believed every word, and you could feel that belief in the sentences, the way you can feel warmth in old wood. It did not have a clause for this. It had protocols for disputes, protocols for resource conflicts, protocols for territorial misunderstandings. It had a lengthy appendix on the arbitration of cultural offenses. It did not have a clause for what you did when someone deleted 4 million of your people on a Tuesday morning and called it a correction. I finished reading it. I sat with it for a moment. Then I closed it. 3,000 years of tranquility. I turned the phrase over. 3,000 years. My species had not fought a real war in 3,000 years. We had been so young when the accord was signed, barely past agriculture, the elder species liked to say, the way adults say it about a child they find charming. We had been the youngest, the smallest, the ones the accord existed in some ways to protect. The protected ones. I thought about that word, protected. I thought about what it implied about us. I thought about what the Verk had seen when they looked at humanity, what all of them saw probably, the Keth and the Solari and the Ven with their careful harmonics and their strongly worded condemnation. I thought about what I had believed about myself this morning before the feed died. A peacekeeping officer, a noise complaint filer, a woman who had not fired a weapon in 8 years. I looked at my hands. Then I stood up, turned off the secondary screen. I did not need to watch any more of the session, and I walked to the window. The city outside was quiet in the wrong way. The kind of quiet that happens when everyone has heard the same thing and nobody has figured out yet what to do with it. Lights on in every building. No movement. I thought about 11 minutes. I thought about 3,000 years. I thought those are not the same kind of number. One of them is an ending. The other one is a very, very long sleep. And somewhere in the architecture of my chest, in a place I had not known existed until approximately 40 minutes ago, something shifted. Not rage. Not grief, though that was there too, sitting heavy and patient. Something older than both. Something that felt less like an emotion and more like a switch. I had spent my entire career managing peace. It occurred to me, standing at that window, that managing peace and being incapable of anything else were not the same thing. The Verk had made an assumption about us. It was a reasonable assumption. We had spent 3,000 years making it look true. I went back to my desk. I opened a new form, not the incident report, a different one. A request for emergency review of Earth's Martial Reclamation Protocols, which had not been opened in so long that the system flagged the file as possibly corrupted from age. It was not corrupted, it was just old. I submitted the request and then I sat back and I let myself feel, for exactly 1 minute, the full weight of what had happened to New Carthage. 4 million people, a harvest festival, a float bumping a transit line. 60 seconds. I gave myself 60 seconds. Then I picked up my coffee, which had gone cold, and I drank it anyway, and I got to work. The archives were not supposed to be beautiful. They were a storage facility, sub-level 4 of the Geneva Peace Monument, which was already the least interesting building in the most deliberately boring city humanity had ever designed. 3,000 years ago, when the accord was signed, someone had decided that the seat of galactic peace should project no aggression whatsoever. and they had achieved this so completely that the entire city felt like a waiting room. Sublevel 4 was supposed to be where we kept the old files, the embarrassing ones, the pre-accord military doctrine, the weapons specifications, the tactical manuals, everything humanity had been quietly asked to set aside when we joined the galactic community as its youngest and most enthusiastically reformed member. I expected dust. I expected degraded storage media and corrupted files and maybe some mold. I found a library. Not a metaphorical library. A literal, climate-controlled, fully indexed, regularly maintained library that some very patient and very quietly defiant human beings had been tending for 3,000 years, updating the storage formats every generation so that nothing would be lost, cataloging every edition, cross-referencing every doctrine shift across every conflict humanity had ever recorded. I stood at the entrance and looked at it for a long moment. "You kept all of it," said Ambassador Vell, the Keth observer assigned to our task force. He was standing beside me, and his voice carried the particular harmonic frequency that, in Keth, indicated profound unsettlement. "We're sentimental," I said. He did not respond to that. He was still looking at the shelves. The Emergency Marshal Reclamation Project had been assembled in 48 hours, which was roughly 47.5 hours faster than anything in the peacekeeping bureaucracy normally moved. Admiral Owen Garrett had managed it, which did not surprise me once I met him. He was 63 years old and looked like someone's favorite grandfather, the kind who kept hard candy in his pocket and knew the names of every grandchild in the neighborhood. He spoke quietly, always quietly. I noticed early on that the volume of someone's voice in his presence was inversely proportional to how seriously he took them. He found me on the second day, standing in front of a section of the archive dedicated to what the catalog called logistical warfare doctrine. "The Verk study us," he said, without preamble. "They have been studying us for decades. They know what we looked like 3,000 years ago. They built their whole strategy on the assumption that what we looked like then is what we are capable of now." He paused. "They are wrong in one very specific way." I waited. 3,000 years ago," he said, "we were still learning. We were mid-process. The Accord caught us on the way to becoming something. The Verk looked at us at the beginning of that process and assumed it was the whole of it. They did not account for 3,000 years of what happens when a species with our history spends its energy on things other than fighting." I looked at the shelf in front of me. Logistical doctrine, supply chain optimization, attrition mathematics. "We got better," I said. "In every conceivable way," he said. He moved on down the corridor, and I followed him. And what he showed me in that archive over the next 6 hours rearranged something fundamental in my understanding of what I was part of. The weapons were the obvious part, and the weapons were genuinely extraordinary. Pre-Accord humanity had, in 3,000 years of conflict, produced some of the most effective instruments of force that had ever been designed. The Keth military historian who was embedded with us, a small, deeply unhappy being named Rel who had been pulled out of comfortable academic retirement for this assignment, spent most of his first day in the archive making sounds of pure distress. Not because the weapons were monstrous, because they were clever, because whoever had designed them had been thinking about problems from angles that the elder species, in their long peace, had simply stopped thinking about. But Owen kept pulling me away from the weapons and toward the other sections. The logistics sections. The planning sections. The sections on what he called the unglamorous art, which was the art of knowing where your people were, what they had, how long it would last, and how to get them more of whatever they needed before they ran out. The art of winning the battle before the battle happened, in maintenance schedules and supply lines, and the mathematics of keeping human beings alive and functional under conditions designed to make that impossible. "The Verk have never fought a long war," Owen said. "They dominate fast. That is the only kind of war they know. Their entire doctrine is built on it. Find the target, remove the target, move on. He paused. We have never been good at being removed. The fabrication unit started running triple shifts on the third day. Not just weapons, ships. The new Shanghai orbital yards had not built a warship in 800 years, and for the first 48 hours that fact showed. There were delays, design conflicts, integration problems, 3,000 years of civilian architecture being asked to remember what military construction felt like. It remembered. By the end of the first week, the yards were running ahead of schedule. The engineering teams had stopped working in shifts because nobody wanted to leave. Someone posted the feed from the yards in the main corridor of the archive, and I would sometimes catch people standing in front of it, just watching the frames go up. I caught Owen watching it one evening. "What are you thinking?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather told me a story," he said. His grandfather had told it to him, about the last time humanity built ships like these, about what it felt like to know that everything you were building was going toward the worst possible use, and about doing it anyway because the alternative was not being there to regret it. He watched the frame go up. "I think about whether they would understand why we're doing this again." "Would they?" He almost smiled. "I think they would understand it better than we do." There was a moment I keep returning to when I think about those first weeks. It happened on day 11, in the deep section of the archive, the oldest part, where the storage media was so ancient that we had to use 3 different translation systems to read it. I found a training manual, handwritten, not digitized, the original physical pages preserved under glass. The handwriting was small and neat, and the language it was written in was an early form of English that I could mostly read if I went slowly. It was a basic infantry manual: positioning, communication under pressure, how to keep people calm when calm felt impossible. At the top of the first page, someone had written a note, not part of the manual, just a note in different handwriting, cramped and quick like someone who had written it fast. It said we were not made for peace. We chose it. Remember the difference. I stood there with that for a long time. Then I took a photograph of it, and I put it in my uniform pocket, and I did not tell anyone about it. I am not entirely sure why. Maybe because it felt like it was meant for me specifically. Maybe because I was not ready yet to say out loud what it made me feel. The first warship rolled out of the new Shanghai yards on day 19. I watched it on the feed with about 40 other people crowded into the main corridor. There was no formal ceremony. Owen had decided against one, which I thought was correct. The ship was not beautiful. It was not elegant the way the Keth vessels were elegant, or luminous the way Solari architecture always seemed to glow from within. It was dense and angular, and it sat in space like it had decided to be there, and was prepared to argue with anyone who disagreed. The yard crews had painted the hull a flat dark gray that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Someone near me said quietly, in a voice that was not quite steady, that it looked angry. I thought that was exactly right. I did not know ships could look angry. I had grown up in a world where ships carried people and cargo and the occasional diplomatic envoy, and none of them needed to look like anything in particular. This one looked like a statement. Ambassador Vell was standing at the back of the corridor. I caught his eye. He held my gaze for a moment, and then he looked back at the feed, and he was quiet in the way that meant he was recalibrating something important. "The Verk are watching too," Owen said, appearing at my elbow. "Good," I said. The Verk High Command issued a statement that evening. It was longer than their first one. It used the word concerning 4 times. It referenced the Accord twice, which I noted because their first statement had not referenced it at all. Concerned, they were concerned. I had been filing a noise complaint 11 days ago. Now I was standing in a 3,000-year-old military archive, watching the first warship humanity had built in 8 centuries take its place in orbit. And the species that had burned 4 million people on a Tuesday morning was using the word concerning. I went back to my desk. I had a lot of work left to do. The one thing I kept coming back to, late at night when the archive was quiet and only the maintenance lights were on, the thing I could not quite put down, was the note at the top of that old manual. We were not made for peace. We chose it. Remember the difference. I thought about the festival in Sector 7, the noise complaint, 8 years without firing a weapon, 3,000 years of the whole species making the same choice, generation after generation, every child born into a world where the hardest thing their parents would ever ask them to fight was a zoning dispute. Choosing it every time, not because we could not do otherwise. Because we decided. And now we were deciding something else. I pulled out my photograph of the note, read it again, put it back in my pocket. Somewhere above me, in the dark of orbit, the ship that looked angry was running its first diagnostic cycles. I thought it was probably passing them. The Solari ambassador found me in the corridor outside the main briefing room on the morning of what we were calling Day 31. Though by then the numbering had started to feel arbitrary. She was small, even for a Solari, and she had the careful, unhurried manner of someone who had been practicing diplomacy for longer than my species had existed in anything resembling its current form. "Commander Voss," she said, "a word." I had about 14 meetings to get to and approximately 4 hours of sleep behind me. Of course, Ambassador. The Accord Council is hoping humanity might pursue a measured and proportional response to the events of New Carthage. She said it with perfect grace, the way you deliver a message you know will not land well but have been asked to deliver anyway. I looked at her, she looked at me. "We're working on the proportional part," I said. She did not find that funny. I was not joking. The Battle of the Drell Corridor was not humanity's first engagement with the Verk since New Carthage. There had been 2 smaller contacts, probing actions on their side and defensive responses on ours. But it was the first time we chose the ground. The first time we moved toward them rather than holding position and hoping they would stop. I was aboard the Unbroken. Owen had insisted I be there, which I had argued about and lost. "You need to see it," he said, in the tone that meant the discussion was finished. "Not on a feed, in the room." He was right, though I would not tell him that for another 3 weeks. The Verk had 17 vessels in the corridor. We brought 22. The numbers were deceptive. Verk ships were larger, better armored by traditional measures, built for the kind of fast dominant strike that had ended New Carthage in 11 minutes. Their commanders were experienced. Their doctrine was proven across 4 species-level conflicts over the past 2 centuries. What their doctrine did not have a name for was what happened when the enemy changed the plan in the middle of everything. Not adapted, not adjusted, changed. Fundamentally, structurally, abandoned the original approach mid-engagement and rebuilt from available information in real time. It is a very human thing to do. It is so human that we had stopped noticing it was unusual. When something stops working, you stop doing it. You try something else. You try 6 something else's simultaneously, and you keep the one that works and you discard the others without grief. You do this fast because the situation is moving, and you do it without asking permission, because the person who might give permission is also in the middle of changing something. The Verk had never fought an enemy that did this. Their communication systems were built for a different model, centralized command, sequential decision-making, the kind of elegant coordination that works beautifully when the enemy is behaving as expected. We were not behaving as expected. Their formation responded to our first move in exactly the way their doctrine prescribed. Then we made a second move, and their formation responded to the first move rather than the second one, because the response time between their command ship and their outer wing was just long enough for us to already be somewhere else. Contact bearing 274. said Lieutenant Owen Fairchild from the tactical station, in the completely level voice he used for everything from a minor sensor glitch to the current situation, which was categorically not minor. "Adjust," I said. He adjusted. That was the whole conversation. In the space of that exchange, 3 of our vessels had already moved, not because anyone had told them to move, not because a command had traveled from the Unbroken to their captains and been processed and actioned, but because their captains had looked at the same situation I was looking at and reached the same conclusion independently and moved. I watched the Verk command ship trying to catch up to a battle that kept being somewhere it had not predicted. Ambassador Vell was on the observation deck during the engagement. He had asked, very formally, to be allowed to witness. Owen had agreed with the condition that he stay out of the way of anyone who needed to be somewhere, which Vell honored completely. He stood at the back of the observation deck, and he did not make a sound. Afterward, after the Verk vessels had pulled back, after the first assessment was being run, after I had stood down from immediate command posture, and had approximately 45 seconds where I was not needed for anything specific, I went to find him. He was still standing at the viewport, looking at the space where the Verk formation had been. "They were confused," I said. "It was not quite a question." "Profoundly," he said. "Their initial response was textbook. Their second response was also textbook. Their third response—" He paused. "There was no third response, not a real one. They were trying to respond to a battle that had already become a different battle." Another pause. "I have read about this. In the academic literature on pre-accord human conflict, I understood it as a concept." He turned to look at me. "Understanding it as a concept is insufficient preparation for watching it happen." I thought about saying something modest. I did not. "We thought the Accord saved you from yourselves," he said. It was quiet, not an accusation, a man who had gotten something wrong trying to understand how. "The Council, the elder species, we believed peace was something that had been given to you, a gift, that without the structure of the Accord you would have." He stopped. "Gone back to what we were," I said. "Yes. Maybe," I said, "but that assumes what we were was fixed, that we stopped changing the moment the Accord was signed." He waited. 3,000 years is a long time to keep getting better at something, I said, even something you're not using. He was quiet for a moment. We may have misread the situation entirely. I did not respond to that because the damage report was coming through, and I needed to read it. 17 names. I read each one. I read their ranks, their assignments, their sectors of origin. I had started doing this after New Carthage, after the feeds came back and the list started being compiled, and I had not stopped. It took longer every time. I was not going to stop. I finished the list, I set it aside, I went back to work. The Verk issued a statement that evening. It was their third. The first had called us a mistake. The second had called us concerning. This one used the phrase significant tactical uncertainty. I read it twice. "Progress," I said to Owen, who was reviewing the same statement at the adjacent console. He looked at me. "We've gone from mistake to concerning to significant tactical uncertainty," I said. "At this rate, in another month they'll be calling us an unanticipated strategic variable." "And after that," he said. I thought about it. "We'll get to that," I said. What I did not say, what I was turning over privately, in the quiet part of my mind that ran parallel to everything else, was something that had started bothering me around day 20 and had not stopped. I was good at this. Not adequate, not functioning, good. The tactics came clean and fast. The decisions organized themselves without effort. The anger, which was real, which had been real since the moment the feed died above New Carthage, was not noise. It was not interference. It was fuel, and it burned clean, and it did not make me worse at anything. It made me sharper. I slept fine. I read the names every night and I sat with them, and then I slept fine. And in the morning the decisions were still clean, and the anger was still useful, and I was still sharp, and none of that felt the way I thought it would feel. I had expected something darker. I had expected the weight of it to accumulate into something that pressed down on everything else. 3,000 years of a species choosing peace, choosing, the note said, not being made for it, and I had assumed that choosing the other thing would come with a cost that showed, that you would see it, that you would feel it grinding. But what I actually felt was something closer to recognition. Like doing something for the first time, and knowing immediately that you have always known how. I did not examine that feeling too closely. I put it in the same pocket where I kept the photograph of the note. I kept working. The fleet was growing. Every week, new ships, new crews who had spent their whole lives in a peacetime corps, running training simulations that were suddenly not simulations, learning the difference between knowing the theory and being inside the fact of it. They were learning fast. Humans always learned fast when the lesson was important enough. And the Werk, I think, were beginning to understand that they had made a very specific kind of error. Not a tactical error, not a strategic error, a definitional one. They had looked at 3,000 years of peace and concluded they understood what we were. They had made a decision based on that conclusion. And the conclusion had been wrong not because the evidence was bad, but because they had never thought to ask what it meant that we had chosen it. The species that chooses something is not the same as the species that is only capable of that thing. We were 3,000 years of a deliberate decision. And we had just decided differently. Intelligence delivered the news on what we were calling Day 47. And it was the kind of news that changes the shape of every decision that comes after it. The Werk had never planned a war. Not with us. Not with anyone. Their entire military doctrine from the beginning was built around a single specific action that they had used successfully against 3 species in the past 2 centuries. Decapitation. Find the center, remove the center, leave nothing to organize around. With the first 3 species it had worked perfectly. One strike or a small sequence of strikes and the target species had been so comprehensively disoriented that resistance had dissolved before it could form. No war, no prolonged engagement, just absence where a species had been. The Werk had looked at humanity, at our young colonies scattered across a dozen systems, at our 3,000 years of enforced tranquility, and they had identified the pattern they recognized. Strike fast. Strike the symbolic center. Let the shock do the rest of the work. New Carthage had been Phase 1. Earth was Phase 2. I sat with that for about 30 seconds. Owen sat across from me and watched me sit with it. He had already had his 30 seconds, I gathered, some time before he called me in. Timeline, I said. Conservative estimate, 90 days. They are repositioning, which suggests they have not decided we are contained enough to move on Earth yet. The Drell corridor rattled something in their planning. They are taking longer than their doctrine typically allows. Because we rattled it. Yes. I thought about what that meant. 90 days if we were lucky. If we continued doing what we were doing, buying time by being more difficult to predict than they had budgeted for. This changes what we're doing, I said. Yes, Owen said again. We can't keep responding. We have to be somewhere they're not expecting. Forward engagement, he said. Take the fight to their space before they bring it to ours. The Council will object. The Council has been objecting to everything we've done since Day 3. Their objections have not, so far, prevented us from doing it. I looked at him. He was being dry, which for Owen meant he was also being serious. They have standing, the Accord. The Accord, he said quietly, does not have a clause for this situation. We discussed this. They have the same accord we do. I thought about the Solari ambassador in the corridor, the proportional response, the strongly worded condemnation of 11 days after 4 million people. I thought about Phase 2, Earth. I thought about 11 minutes. We need the full fleet, I said. Yes. We need to move within 60 days. Yes. And we need everyone to understand what we're committing to. This is not a defensive posture anymore. This is a choice, a different kind of choice. Owen was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was in the voice he used when something mattered more than usual, which meant it was so quiet I had to lean slightly forward to hear it. Every generation of our species for 3,000 years made the same choice. They looked at what we were and what we were capable of, and they said, "Not today, not for this. We choose the other thing." He paused. We are being asked to make a different choice, and when we make it, we should make it clearly, not from panic, not from reaction, a decision. I thought about the note in my pocket. We were not made for peace. We chose it. Remember the difference. I want a full fleet assembly within 30 days, I said. I want every captain who can be there in person, not on a feed, in the room. And the council. I'll speak to the council, I said. I'll speak to them before the assembly. What will you say? I stood up. I'll tell them we are making a decision. I'll tell them we understand what it costs. I'll tell them that Phase 2 exists and that the cost of not deciding is higher than the cost of deciding wrong. Owen nodded once slowly. And if they still object? Vel's voice came from the doorway. He had arrived quietly enough that neither of us had heard him. He was leaning against the frame with the look of a being who has been reconsidering something enormous for a very long time. Then they object, I said, and we do it anyway. Vel absorbed that. You understand what you are becoming, what this will look like to the elder species, to the galactic community. What does it look like? I said. It was not a challenge. I genuinely wanted to know what he saw. He was quiet for a long moment. It looks like you were never what we thought you were, which means we will have to decide what we actually are in relation to you. That's fair, I said. We're doing the same thing. The fleet assembly happened on day 71, in the largest dock bay of the new Shanghai yards, which was the only space on Earth that could fit enough ships and enough people to constitute the whole of what we had built. I had specifically requested no formal ceremony, no rehearsed speeches, no protocol. I stood in front of 1,200 people, and I told them the truth. I told them what Phase 2 was. I told them the timeline. I told them what forward engagement meant and what it would cost, and that I could not promise them the cost would feel worth it, because some costs do not feel worth anything no matter what they purchase. And then I told them what the alternative was. I told them about the 3 species who had not been given time to decide. I told them that their names were in the archive, if anyone wanted to look. I told them that the Verx pattern worked because it had always worked, and the only variable that had ever changed in the pattern was us, and we had 60 days to remain a variable. Nobody spoke for a moment after I finished. Then Owen, standing at the back of the room, began to clap, not dramatically, just steadily, the way you applaud something that is right rather than something that is exciting. The room followed. I looked out at 1,200 faces. Some of them were scared. All of them were decided. The vote passed. I went back to my quarters afterward, and I sat on the edge of my bunk, and I took the photograph out of my pocket, and I read the note again. We were not made for peace. We chose it. Remember the difference. I remembered the difference. I thought about Vel's question in the briefing room doorway, what we were becoming, whether this felt like what I had feared. I thought about sleeping fine, about the names, about the anger that burned clean and made me sharper instead of worse, about the decisions that came fast and clear, about the thing in my chest that had shifted the night the feed died and had not shifted back. I thought, I am making a choice, a clear one. I see what it is, I see what it costs, I see what not choosing costs more. We had been a species that chose peace for 3,000 years. Now we were a species choosing something else. For the first time in 3,000 years, with our eyes open and our hands steady and our reasons clear. I put the photograph back in my pocket. I went to sleep. In the morning, the fleet was waiting. The Werk sued for peace on a Tuesday. I found out while I was at my desk. There was coffee. The report came through on a standard channel in a standard format, and for a moment my brain tried to file it the same way it would have filed a zoning dispute or a noise complaint, because the format was so ordinary and the content was so completely not. I read it 3 times. Then I leaned back in my chair and I looked at the ceiling and I let myself sit with it for a moment. Just a moment. Not long. There was still too much to do for long. The Werk High Command had made a calculation. That was the only way to understand it, because the Werk did not do anything that was not a calculation. They had looked at the forces approaching Werk Prime, at the engagement record of the previous 70 days, at the rate at which our tactics had evolved, and the rate at which their ability to predict those tactics had not, and they had done the math. The math said stop. They were not cowards. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters, and because I think saying otherwise gives us something we did not earn. The Werk had built an empire on the back of a strategy that had worked without exception for 200 years. They had committed to New Carthage with total confidence, the confidence of beings who had seen this pattern resolve the same way every single time. They had been wrong, specifically and completely, about one thing. They had not expected us to be what we were. When the math changed, they changed with it. That is not cowardice. That is a different kind of intelligence than the kind I had been exercising for the past 70 days, but it is intelligence. The peace terms arrived 36 hours after the initial contact. I read them in full, alone, before sharing them with Owen. Then I sat with them the same way I had sat with the Pax Accord on the night New Carthage burned, looking for what they said and what they didn't say, looking for what they meant and what they were afraid to mean. They seeded, not just from human space, from the 3 systems they had cleared in the century before New Carthage, systems where the species they had removed had lived. They could not give those species back. Nobody could give them back. But the space was acknowledged, on the record, as having been wrongfully taken, and the Werk were formally committing to the principle that it could never be theirs. It was not enough. It would never be enough. 4 million people, 3 species who were not there anymore to hear the terms. It was what there was. Vel found me in the observation deck. He always found me there when something important happened, which I had stopped being surprised by. He simply knew, somehow, that that was where I would be. He stood beside me, and we looked at the stars for a while without talking. "You won," he said. "We survived," I said. That was the honest version. We had survived, and in surviving we had changed something permanent in the understanding of what our species was, and now we had to figure out what to do with both of those facts. He considered that for a long moment. "What will you do with it?" he said, "the thing you woke up?" I had been waiting for the question. I had been dreading it in the way you dread the questions you have not answered even to yourself, because you know the answer is not ready yet, and asking it out loud will not make it more ready. It will just make the gap more visible. I thought about the note, the photograph. We were not made for peace. We chose it. Remember the difference. I thought about sleeping fine, about the anger that felt sweet and familiar, a known thing I reached for the way you reach for something in the dark that you know exactly where to find, about the decisions that had come clean and fast, everyone, about how good at this I had been. How naturally. I thought about 1,200 people in a dock bay, decided, about Owen clapping, steady and unhurried, about Lieutenant Fairchild saying contact in his level voice and me saying adjust, and the whole thing moving without friction. I thought about the 17 names on the first list after the Drell corridor, and every list after, and the lists getting longer, and reading every name and sleeping fine. And I thought, what do I do with the fact that I cannot tell, with certainty, Which of those things I should be proud of and which of them should worry me? I don't know yet, I said. Vel nodded, very slowly, like he had expected that answer and respected it more than a confident one. The elder species will want a new accord, he said. A revised framework. You are no longer the youngest member in the way you were. You are something different now and everyone knows it, and the community will want that formalized. I know. They will be afraid, he said. In a way they were not afraid before. They will dress the fear in diplomatic language and institutional process, because that is what the elder species do with fear. But underneath it will be real. I know that too. Does it bother you? I thought about it. The honest answer took longer than I expected. Not the way it should, I said. He looked at me. I know what we are, I said. I know what this past 70 days was. I know what we lost and what we found, and I know that some part of what we found should be put back down carefully and some part of it earned its place. I paused. I just don't know yet with precision which part is which. Perhaps, Vel said, that is the most human thing you have said to me. The uncertainty. The willingness to say you don't know, and to keep going anyway. I looked at the stars. The Verk ships were pulling back across those stars, and the math had been calculated, and the terms were on the table, and somewhere in all of that was the shape of whatever we were going to be next. A species that had chosen peace for 3,000 years. A species that had chosen something else for 70 days. A species standing now at the juncture of those two choices, trying to understand what the combination meant. The new accord negotiations took 4 months. I was part of the human delegation for the first 6 weeks, and then I asked Owen to take over the formal sessions, because I was not built for 6-hour discussions about language and precedent. And he was. And he did it with the same quiet, unhurried competence he brought to everything. I spent those 4 months doing what I had been doing since day one, reading the names, working, thinking. The Keth elder who had once called humanity the Accord's most charming charity case requested a formal military alliance in week 3 of the negotiations. I was not in the room when Owen received the request, but he told me about it that evening with the particular dry tone he used when something pleased him considerably. What did you say? I asked. I said we would think about it. Good, I said. The other elder species followed, one by one, in their own time, in their own careful diplomatic language. Some of them were genuinely relieved. Some of them were afraid and dressed it in enthusiasm. All of them were updating their understanding of what it meant to share a galaxy with us. I thought that was probably healthy. I thought about something Vel had said, back before the fleet assembly, back when the decision was still being made. He had said it looked like we had never been what they thought we were. That was true and also not quite right. We had been exactly what they thought we were for 3,000 years. The choice was real. The peace was real. The noise complaints and the zoning disputes and the harvest festivals and the 8 years between range qualifications were real, and the beings who lived all of that were genuinely those beings, not a mask over something else. And also we were this. Both things were true at the same time, and I suspected that this was the part that the elder species were going to take the longest to understand. Not the capability. They had seen the capability now, and the math was updated. The part that would take longest was understanding how both could be true simultaneously. How you could be the species that chose peace for 3,000 years, and also the species that did what we had done in the past 70 days, and have both choices come from the same real place. I went back to my desk on the morning the new accord was signed. I had a stack of integration paperwork a centimeter thick, frameworks for formal military standing within the galactic community, protocols for the new peacekeeping designation, which was a different thing now than it had been 4 months ago, and would need new definitions for almost everything. I made coffee, I sat down. I pulled up the first form. This one, at least, had better fields. Whoever had designed it had been paying attention. There was room for nuance. There was a notes section that was actually large enough to say something in. I started filling it out. Name, rank, designation, primary function. I got to the field that asked for operational philosophy and I stopped. It was a small field. The old forms always had small fields, as if whoever made them believed that what you were could be summarized in a sentence. Maybe it could. I typed, "We were not made for peace. We chose it. For 3,000 years we chose it. We choose it again now with full knowledge of what the alternative looks like." I looked at it for a moment. Then I added one more line. "And we will keep choosing it, because that is the specific kind of thing we are." I submitted the form. I finished my coffee. Outside, in the slow turning of another ordinary morning, the city was waking up. The yards were still running. They would run for years yet, because a species that had just remembered what it was capable of did not simply forget again. And there was something right about maintaining that understanding, that preparedness, even in peace. The new accord was signed. The terms were filed. The elder species were adjusting. Somewhere in the archive under Geneva, a small, neat handwritten note sat under glass, preserved for 3,000 more years if we were careful. I kept the photograph. I kept the names. I kept working. We had been the galaxy's charity case for 3,000 years, the youngest species, the protected ones, the ones the Accord had been designed in part to keep safe from themselves and from anyone who might see them as easy. We had not been easy. We had been patient. There is a difference. The Verk had learned it. The elder species were learning it. I had learned it about myself, 70 days ago, sitting in a chair in front of a console that could not find the right field for what had happened. I knew it now. We had not been made for peace. We had chosen it. And we were choosing it again now, knowing everything, with our eyes open and the names in our pocket and the memory of what the other choice had felt like still clear and close. You're welcome, I thought, to no one in particular, to the galaxy that had watched and the species that had doubted, and the 3,000 years of peaceful mornings that had given us everything we needed to do what we had done. You're welcome. It was Tuesday. I went back to work.